Welcome back. When last we left off, what was I doing, actually? Oh, right, I was trying to not burn my dupes alive. Yeah, that. Not doing terribly well on that front, but sucks to be them, I guess, because my coolant loops are a little bit closer to warm loops, so I don't anticipate the temperatures dropping for a good long while yet. That seems like it will be complicated and inconvenient to solve, so let's continue the time-honored tradition of ignoring it and working on something else while we pretend it doesn't exist, shall we? Temperatures in my machine shop may be rising, but down in the basement, things are starting to cool off quite a bit, and I am now ready to refit my steam cooling systems to a more traditional conduction design. As harped on at great length in the previous episode, all this really involves is putting a floor around the aqua tuner to capture water and messing with some pipes. The next few cycles pass on pretty quietly, and other than me micromanaging the deletion of a bunch of zombie spore-producing flower nodes that I unearthed in the oil biome, I'm mostly hands-off. Because I'm too busy doing research. My steam supply is not going to last forever, especially when taking into account where this world is going. Simply put, I want to start bending this game over my knee, and for that, I need power. Unlimited power, to be precise, and I am sadly bereft of infinitely reproducing magma pools to steamify to produce that with my current setup. There are 8 methods of producing power in the base version of Oxygen Not Included. Manual generators, through the power of slave labor, can turn 1,000 kilocalories of food and 60 kilos of oxygen into roughly a 350 watt per cycle power supply, which sucks. Coal generators and wood burners are similarly uninteresting. Natural gas generators and petroleum generators are very interesting because if my math is right, they give me a positive feedback water production loop in addition to power, but they require infrastructure capable of maintaining extreme temperature differentials to get that feedback loop, and I can barely deal with the ambient heat as it is, so I'm definitely not ready to mess with them yet, which leaves steam turbines, which I want to get away from, hydrogen generators, and solar panels. Solar panels are something I'll touch on later because they seem like a massive noob trap that I intend to jump headfirst into anyway just because of all the unique engineering challenges they will present. But not making use of hydrogen generators early on in the run can best be summarized as a massive L moment on my part. Electrolyzers running at full tilt use 120 watts to turn 1 kilo of water into 888 grams of oxygen and 112 grams of hydrogen per second. Even if I slap a water pump, 2 gas pumps, and an air filter on top of this system, most of which are entirely unnecessary, that only brings the total power consumption of an electrolyzer system to 960 watts, which is substantially less than the 1200 watts produced by a buffed hydrogen generator burning 100 grams of waste hydrogen per second. I kind of need oxygen to breathe, so this is literally just free power that I have been leaving on the table for like 700 cycles now? Welcome to my test world, by the way. I spend a lot of time here trying to cure my stupid. Not that you would notice it. With numbers like that, the next obvious question is, how many unnecessary bits of the design can I strip out of this system to make it more power efficient? The electrolyzer itself is a hard requirement, because, obviously, and pumps only burn about 12 watts per second per full electrolyzer, which means I need to focus my attention on the filters and gas pumps if I want to get anywhere. I have to have a pump feeding hydrogen packets into the generators, but hydrogen is so light that I can dump the filter in favor of this, like, fume vent kind of setup with an air pressure sensor regulating the gas pump, and that setup will let me separate and pipe hydrogen for about 50 watts per electrolyzer. The real problem is the oxygen. I will need to pipe some of it for industrial use and supplying atmosuits, but natural gas diffusion is incredibly slow, and electrolyzers overpressurize at 2,000 grams, so I will either need to spam out a bunch of them everywhere, which is doable but inconvenient, or find a low-power way of increasing their gas diffusion speed. I spent way too long messing around with various unpowered pump ideas, and while I did find a couple of interesting solutions, I can't really say that any of them were good. My first attempt was one that uses a massive amount of doors with a timer controlling an open-close cycle to shove gas out of the way, but that kind of just makes the diffusion issue worse because now there's things in the way of the gas and overpressure, and half their breathing room is blocked with doors. So when doors didn't work, I played around a little bit with dropping fluids down 1 block wide shafts. The idea being that if I could somehow compress gas underneath the liquid as it fell, I could kind of squeeze it down the tube like Go-Gurt and out of the sides with airflow tiles. This didn't work because all the fluids I tried wanted to trade tiles with the gases instead of compress them, so they mostly ignored each other, even when I packed a tube with an utterly unfeasible amount of liquid. The opposite route of bubbling hydrogen up an oxygen tube just made things worse, so that was a bust too. My next idea was to maybe try and displace the gas at the point of the electrolyzer, kind of like how my gas tanks can store infinite volumes of gas by pumping it into a vent covered in a little bit of fluid. I don't know why I didn't try fluids first, because, like, come on, that's kind of obvious, but I first tried it with blobs of carbon dioxide, sour gas, natural gas, and chlorine. Go figure. So that design worked for maybe 10 seconds before the electrolyzer deleted the gas packets, but I figured I was onto something, so I finally got smart, used a second electrolyzer as a control, and then tried pouring a bit of oil on the first one. Because I am a scientist. And it actually just made their output worse, even when I removed all the tiles surrounding the thing and replaced them with airflow tile. I'm not sure why, but my working theory is that the electrolyzers just output gas in all 4 of the tiles they occupy, and by blocking 2, I was forcing it to overpressurize the other 2 and pump less as a result. So working off of that theory, I then tried the entirely impractical to implement solution of immersing the electrolyzer in 4 very different packets of fluid surrounded by airflow tiles on all sides, which should theoretically block all of its preferred gas output spots without technically waterlogging it. And it worked. Really, really well, actually. The dripped out electrolyzer just straight up does not clog. Though later on I do find designs that do clog, so I should perhaps rephrase that. The dripped out electrolyzer usually doesn't clog, even in overpressurized environments. The sucky part is that A, now I have to build one of these things in survival legitimately, and when I finally gave in and looked up how electrolyzers actually work, discovered that B, I was wrong and had just made a lucky guess, and C, that this design is basically standardized in the oxygen not included community as of about 8 years ago, which really makes me wonder if I invented the design independently or just heard the theory explained in a video almost a decade ago and forgot about it. Anyway, theoretical self-gaslighting aside, my plan is to build a temporary but upgraded design with what I know now about how electrolyzers work somewhere on the right of the map. The whole system is self-sustaining gas and power-wise, and pumping water is easy, so the only real connections it needs to have with the rest of my base are gas output lines and water input lines, and I guess ideally a way for oxygen to diffuse without being pumped. I have some clever plans for that, but I will hold off on explaining until the superstructure is in because, wow, wouldn't you know it, this project requires me to make some holes in the ground, and that realization does nothing to calm the suspicion that I am playing a retextured bingo knockoff where the free square is environmental destruction. I had intended electrolysis upgrades to be a quick and dirty task that I could check off and move on from, but as all my projects are wont to do, this one quickly appropriated 50-something neckbeard in a white van driving in circles around a daycare levels of feature creep, and ended up turning into Goose spends 2 hours excavating the entire upper right quadrant of the map, for no conceivable reason. Amazingly, this is still a productive thing for me to be doing because I found yet another geyser that I somehow missed earlier that outputs oodles of hot salt water, a bunch of set-piece things of dubious value, and am even finally getting around to capping off and automating gas extraction from my chlorine geyser, which has been a project on my list since I've known that it existed. Notably, I didn't make the electrolyzer setup though, so yeah. Productivity, 8 out of 10. Just really nailing it. Task focus? Somewhere between 1.5 and hey look a squirrel? I do eventually get my rear end gear if for no other reason than oxygen pressure is dropping across my base. Mass expansion combined with an electrolyzer setup that is so badly designed it can't output enough oxygen to feed anyone is not a great combination when it comes to maintaining ambient breathability, and I find that needing to breathe is a very strong motivator. That motivation results in the creation of whatever you want to call this thing. I'm leaning more towards butt ugly myself, but I will let you form your own opinions. It has almost none of the beautiful efficiency I dreamed my new oxygen setup would have, but this tech is largely untested by me, and I'm going to be replicating it at some point further down the line, presumably after I know what I'm doing, so all it needs to do is work. And work it does. Oh boy, does this thing do work. In addition to being self-sustaining off of only a third of its total hydrogen output, this thing is theoretically outputting enough oxygen for 24 duplicates to subsist on comfortably. Theoretically. The reality is that the physics gremlins have made themselves known again, and there are a couple of quirks that are slowing it down quite a lot. For one, the left-hand electrolyzer keeps deleting the fluid that I put in it and dropping efficiency. I'm not sure why this is happening, particularly because the other two have identical setups and are cooperating just fine, but if nothing else, it proves that fluid deletion is a mechanic I have to worry about for designs like this, so yay, we will call it a learning experience. This thing still outputs way too much oxygen. I was kind of able to keep the third electrolyzer functional by pumping in a bunch more salt water and only having 3 fluids in the cage, because then it gets in this weird loop where it shoves the water over and it flows back, but still, really seems arbitrary, and I'm going to feel really stupid when I figure out why it's doing it. Just as I'm finished up with the oxygen crisis, a new one emerges from an entirely unexpected angle. I am entirely 100% out of dirt. Yeah, kinda weird saying that coming from a Minecraft background, but such is the world we live in. Dirt isn't a terribly useful material on its own, but it is required in a lot of agricultural applications, and in my case, no dirt equals no mealwood for my Dreco farms, and no sleet wheat for my duplicates. Not, mind you, that the latter has ever really been a problem, because I have grown exactly 0 sleet wheat this entire playthrough. Unlike literally every other problem thus far, I can't solve it via mining either, because other than a tiny little pocket next to my storage room, I already dug all my dirt up, so I need to manufacture it somehow. However, I'm happy to report that after some intensive research, I think I have come to the perfect solution. And I know it's the perfect solution, because the first step is taking a whole bunch of porta potties, balancing them on locked doors, and then making the duplicates use them until they overflow. Because reasons. Dirt can be made out of a lot of different things, but most of them either directly or indirectly involve either A, duplicate labor, which I am loath to make use of, or B, a relatively large amount of water that I would rather be using for something more productive, such as contributing to the steam blob underneath my base. That led me to looking into puffs. Puffs consume polluted oxygen and output slime, and slime, when heated above 125 degrees, turns into dirt, so I just need a bunch of polluted oxygen. That is where critters called morbs come in. The in-game guide is incredibly unhelpful in telling you how to get them, so I had to look it up. But it turns out all you need to make a bunch of morbs is to get a bunch of full outhouses together and then reset their state every couple of cycles. Morbs produce roughly 12 kilograms of polluted oxygen per cycle. In theory, I really don't think I want to trust the wiki on this number because it does not seem like whoever wrote the article did very rigorous testing, but we'll go with it because it's probably close enough. Unlike any other critter I have found thus far, morbs have no cramming limit and require no food to survive. Gee, I wonder if this mechanic is exploitable. And so, with 8 porta potties fully stocked, I expect to get 4 morbs a day, equating to, theoretically, a consistently scaling production of somewhere around 48 kilos of polluted oxygen per day squared. Yes, the units line up, no, you don't get to question it. So that little project is going to take a while to get off the ground. That's fine, though, because it's time to once again set my sights on space, and all of the lovely things that I can extract from it. My vat of petroleum has long since cooled down enough to be safe to handle, and I have plenty of oxalite from the random wild puffs that keep stealing my oxygen. So the only stumbling block to further space exploration is my complete and utter lack of a working launch pad. I've given some thought about how I want to manage the meteor problem, and after some soul searching and spamming several hundred meteors in my test world that had nothing to do with the experimenting, I just did that because it was fun, the simplest solution I've arrived at is to ignore them. They don't hurt rockets, wires, or automation cable. Meteors come down straight enough that a one-block overhang is usually enough to protect things, and ladders work fine even if they're broken, so as long as I make the entire place out of blast-proof materials, they kind of don't make much of a difference. And also, wow, look at that! I have almost 40 tons of steel. It's amazing how these things work out, isn't it? That plan immediately gets thrown in the bin after taking one look at the bill for my oh-so-intelligent plan, and I will admit I'm starting to have some reservations about its current and theoretical level of intelligence, by which I mean I realized 5 minutes into build that not having blast doors was phenomenally stupid regardless of how much reinforcement I've done to the sides of the launch tube, and immediately put them back in. Getting the automation working for this thing is going to be a little bit hairy, especially once I take into account the mess that is going to come from solar panels, so for now it's all going to be manual control, but I do have a launch pad, complete with a working rocket. So, bye-bye, Cass, you have a great trip! And I forgot to retract the gantry again. Maybe I should be automating this thing. Fine. I guess I will be responsible about the whole thing. Not. Rocket automation stuff requires some surprisingly sophisticated conditional automation to get working, but all of it hinges on having good sensor networks, which themselves require me to solve the whole space rocks keep falling on my head problem in a way that is vaguely sustainable. Of course, if I want to have solar panels, the solar panel infrastructure has to cooperate with the sensor grid infrastructure, and all of it has to cooperate with the blast doors and regolith processing infrastructure. Let's start with the hard requirements. I need blast doors, or space rocks will turn my base into a vaguely gritty soup. The sensors will need to be under the doors to see things when the doors are open, and all the regolith needs eventually to end up near a mining drill so it does not obstruct sensor view. Hot regolith falling on a drill jams it, and hot regolith falling on an uncooled sensor for too long will break it, so any design with a chance of this happening is an immediate rejection. The setup I went with tiles blast doors all the way across the absolute roof of the map and mounts a steel drill upside down on a sideways oriented steel mechanized airlock, with the scanner just barely inside the drill's active range. This setup does a lot of convenient things for me, and also makes me think maybe this is one of those you saw it 8 years ago and are stealing the idea moments. Having blast doors so high up on the map prevents too much regolith from collecting in any one column, because if it piles more than 2 blocks high, it's deleted by the map ceiling. So, for all you efficiency hogs out there in the audience squealing about the lost materials, don't. I assure you, the regolith will not be missed. Mounting the drill on a mechanized airlock lets me quickly open the airlock to drop regolith and items into the mining area, and then close the airlock to enable the drill when I want to dig it apart. And without this, I'd have to mount the drill on the floor where it could clog, or on the blast doors, which have to then close again for the drill to work, which kind of violates the whole point of the design. Most importantly, for my OCD, the whole thing tiles perfectly in a 16-block increment, which lets me fit exactly 7 of them on each side of the rocket pod without any ugly door clipping or overhang or mess at all. And 7 is a very important number because solar panels are 7 blocks wide. So, that's regolith and sensor suites taken care of. Where do we stick the solars in this whole system? And for that matter, how do we power all of the systems with the solars? This is where things get a little bit goosey. The first problem is that my theoretical degree in materials engineering is telling me that glass is not steel. Solar panels, which are made of glass, are therefore intensely vulnerable to overheat damage because glass is not steel and glass does not have steel's benefits. And if regolith so much as briefly brushes over them, they are going to overheat and die. To prevent this, we should probably put some sort of transparent, thermally resistant material over the solar panel to protect it. Like, solid blocks of glass, which, despite being made out of literally the same material, are somehow very thermally resistant in this form. So that makes a certain kind of nonsense and doesn't seem very logical, but it turns out that windows absorb 10% of the light that passes through them, which means 10% less solar power for me. So the actual solution to this problem is not to cover your solar panels in crystal clear glass, and instead to cover them in a meter-thick layer of metal mesh tiling, which maintains the thermal resistance needed to withstand regolith, but is somehow also perfectly transparent to light. And before you ask about all the open mechanical doors, mining drills, laser sensors, automation cables, automation modules, open blast doors, wires, pipes, ladders, and dropped regolith that has literally been mined from the solar panels not a second ago, don't worry, all of that is transparent too. I, too, find that solar panels are at their most efficient when wrapped in a meter-thick layer of solid metal grating and buried under several tons of rock dust. In fact, it's funny that this topic comes up. You could really make a series out of this. With this wonderful technology, we can make solar power now. In theory. Can't really do anything with it if we don't have storage, though. And the only way of storing power is batteries, obviously. But to use them, we have to do, math. Solar panels can produce a maximum of 380 watts, and all of my doors, drills, and sensors consume 120 per unit. Every modular section will contain somewhere between 0 and 1 space sensor, and between 2 and 3 solar panels, and all of them will need to power 4 blast doors, a mechanical door, and a drill. Meteor showers don't last long, but if I have a shower midday, I will lose most of my power generation, and at a minimum, I should be able to store enough excess power for a day's operation, just because, obviously. One full cycle of 4 blast doors costs roughly 48,000 joules, running a sensor for a full cycle costs 72,000, and the door and drill costs are negligible. Smart batteries store 20,000 joules, so all of that gives me a price tag of at least 3 batteries for each segment and an additional 4 for each segment with a sensor, not counting any that I use to smooth out the power draw over the rest of the grid. At least they don't need to be made out of steel. With that forever project slowly clunking along in the background, oh wait, no, that's just my CPU, don't mind me, let's get back to the dirt problem. That is to say, it's Morbin time. I feel disturbed. Anyway, my Morb factory has been astoundingly effective, to the point where I'm seriously considering doing away with my electrolyzers entirely and producing all my oxygen with deodorizers. Regardless, it makes the slime part of the whole operation real simple. I crammed a bunch of Morbs in a box, and then we'll vent the gas into the still under construction puffed ranch. If I want more slime, I will put more Morbs in the box and cram more puffs in. Easy peasy. Back up top, my dupes have finished wiring in all the solar panels and power systems needed for my new ceiling unit to self-sustain, so the final step is to add in egregious amounts of coolant. Batteries, in a vacuum, have a really nasty habit of automatically overheating themselves because their passive discharge rate will build up heat forever, and as much as possible I want to avoid dropping blazing hot regolith on my drills or my sensors, so once the batteries have been cooled, I run the coolant cycle back through the blast doors. My coolant of choice here is petroleum, because like oil, it has a high boiling point and a low freezing point, which is necessary for handling the 300+ degree blast doors, and unfortunately, it has a problematically low specific heat capacity. But at the time, I rationalized that regolith also has a very low specific heat capacity, so my hope was that it would be able to handle energy transfer regardless. Heat transfer in a vacuum is a little bit scuffed, so I'm going to need to flood the battery chamber with some sort of gas before the batteries overheat themselves, but I have basically infinite oxygen and a convenient pipe setup nearby, so I expected that to be easy enough to do. Also, I lied. The final step is to then add in some power logistics to route the excess power away from the solar grid and into whatever I want, and to then slap down some sweepy docks with automation to ship all of the goodies back into my main colony for further processing. there's no sense in letting all of the tasty goodies pile up on the surface when they could be doing me some good instead. Since everything in there is in a vacuum and I can't supply the place with gas to passively enable heat transmission, all of the new stuff gets added to the coolant loop with some conduction panels behind it to keep it from melting. So, that took literally an entire day of my life to get working. But it doesn't matter unless you're me or Ducky, because we finally have fullerene, and that means we have supercoolant. Not a lot, mind you, because the yield from an entire low-tier rocket trip is barely enough to make one round of the stuff, which is only enough to fill 10 liquid pipes, but it is enough for a very special project. And that project is supercooled gas. The hydrogen rocket engine burns a combination of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen to produce thrust, and it is very, very good at doing that. The trade-off is the difficulty that comes from sourcing liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, and it is so difficult that without supercoolant it is very nearly impossible to make the stuff. Thermo aquatuners consume the same amount of power regardless of how much fluid is in a blob of pipe or how thermally dense that fluid is. So things like oil are about half as efficient as water just because they have less thermal mass. This effectively means that they work by reducing the temperature of your fluids by a flat rate rather than extracting a constant amount of thermal energy per cycle, which has implications for good or ill. But to make matters worse, if they cool your fluid below its freezing point, your pipes blow up, which forces you to make some very harsh trades between performance and efficiency in the early game. Supercoolant solves both of these issues because it will happily go down past the negative 250 odd degrees required to liquefy hydrogen without freezing, and it will do so while being remarkably energy dense, making it, as the name implies, the best coolant in the game for nearly every thermal transfer operation. So, it turns out that no, petroleum is not a particularly great coolant for space applications. It is actually really terrible. As anticipated, this was because of its low thermal density, which is to say that the stuff cools great, but there isn't enough staying power for it to do what I need it to do. What was unanticipated is the complete unmitigated 40-cycle long disaster this one mistake caused. It all started with a meteor shower. When meteor showers are detected, the blast doors close, which takes them from a perfectly insulated state to a perfectly conductive one relative to the piping that runs coolant through them. When the doors close, they are very, very hot, and that very, very hot door touches the very, very cold coolant and instantly flash heats the coolant to around 270 degrees Celsius. This is bad. The bath of petroleum that I'm using as a heatsink did an admirable job of fighting back the heat on the first loop around of this very hot coolant, but by the second, the doors have already reheated the coolant again, without losing too much of their relative temperature, and the bath has picked up too much heat to adequately cool the loop for a third time. So, by that third time, I am now shooting 150-degree petroleum through a system intended to be running at maybe a third of that temperature. My delicate electronics in this 150-degree ecosystem don't much like the sudden global warming, and in protest, the batteries spontaneously self-terminated and my steam turbine stalled, resulting in no more cooling going to the aquatuner, which then breaks, and no more power going to the doors or sensors, which are then turned off. While I was fixing that, the next meteor cycle took my disabled sensors and open doors as an invitation and decided to bomb the living daylights out of me, which breaks everything that isn't nailed to the floor and heats up everything that's just starting to cool off again that it somehow hasn't already destroyed. All of this problem can be solved by pulling my coolant pipes out of the very hot blast doors and putting them into the marginally less hot bits directly underneath them. And I just finished re-chilling my coolant bath to try and purge the hot coolant from its current death spiral. And with those two fixes, everything should reach homeostasis again once the backlog heat is deleted, but there is a valuable lesson to be learned here. And that lesson is, don't try to refrigerate the entire solar system. The solar system will win. Or more accurately, don't try and do it with petroleum. Supercoolant would probably have no issues, but that is going to be an experiment for later. In light of this little experience, I have revised my opinions of the HVAC company that I was complaining about a while ago that redid my work AC. They may have messed up in some truly incomprehensible ways, but I'm forced to admit that at least they didn't bugger up hard enough to cause it to rain flaming space rocks in my office, so I was going to make a joke about throwing stones in glass houses, but given what I just had to deal with, it kind of seems like poor taste. Setting aside that one minor case of, oops, the entire sky is falling, things are going quite well here in expanding supercoolant production is my highest priority at the moment for reasons that seem really obvious, and the need to get more fullerene dovetails nicely with my need to further expand my space program, so my next project is to reinvest all the fullerene I've collected into what I think will be a better rocket fuel delivery system. No idea if it will actually be better, but messing it up doesn't run the risk of ruining 200 cycles of work, so that's a plus. And yeah, gotta say, after some testing, I am pretty happy with it. It is not polished by any stretch of the imagination, but the core concepts are all working, which is a refreshing change from the Rock'em Sock'em HVAC attempt. Like any cooler, I have a heat dilution setup and a coolant loop on a temperature sensor to avoid freezing the very expensive and valuable coolant. Unlike any other cooler, though, this one is self-limiting. Once I've filled a reservoir with liquid matter, the vent providing its gaseous form is flooded, and without any gaseous matter to cool, the coolant will chill itself down below its shutoff threshold and automatically turn the machine off for me. Weirdly enough, the real complication involved getting the gas to the rocket. Oxygen and hydrogen are liquid in a very narrow temperature band, and they love to crack pipes, even if they are insulated. My solution to this was to just pre-chill my pipe runs in a kind of compromised temperature range that's colder than the freezing point of oxygen and warmer than the vaporization point of hydrogen. So if the fluid stays in the pipe for too long, it'll still freeze or vaporize, but it does give me long enough to get the stuff in the rocket tanks and then feed the excess back into its safe storage zone. So it works. Now that space is reasonably accessible to me and my colony is not at risk of collapse due to bad heat management practices, the world is kind of my oyster. It would be fairly trivial to beat the game at this point, but that was never the goal, so I think what little remains of this episode and the next and probably final episode will instead focus on trying to bend this wonderful monster of a game over my knee until it snaps. On that topic, from my space missions, I've been getting things that let me recharge my vacillator's. So my first question is the good old faithful, does it stack? Yes. It actually stacks quite a few times. Past a certain point, it does tell you to chill out on stacking your dupes, but not before I'm able to put Beefsteak, Sunny Disposition, Diver's Lungs, and Regenerative on Wesley, who is now basically the duplicate equivalent of Captain America, with a degree in mechanical engineering. I foresee myself doing this many times in the future. And my last project for the day is going to be revisiting the last real open-ended problem left in my colony, which is the food problem. Berry sludge is a good quality foodstuff that doesn't spoil, which sounds decent, and it probably is if you can actually make it, but my Sleet Wheat farm has thus far still not produced a single grain of this stuff, and I cannot be bothered to do the environmental control work necessary to fix that. Instead, I'm going to engage in the very fun Goose typical pastime of massive animal rights violations. Shovelvoles, an animal that I have largely rendered extinct from the map because of their incredibly annoying habit of pooping space rock everywhere, eat regolith, drop 16 kilograms of meat when they die, and produce an egg every 6 cycles when mature and well cared for. They also don't have an entity cramming limit. Very interesting. It's also very exploitable. My plan is to isolate a few shovelvoles in a wonderful lead-lined box that they can't drill into, stuff them full of regolith and cuddles until they explode in fertility, and repeat the process with their many, many children. Once I have a sustainable population, all of the excess eggs from that population will go into a second box where they will hatch and grow into adults and starve to death, producing a very large amount of very inhumanely sourced meat. The best part about this wonderful plan is that it doesn't take that many voles to do this. 1 egg every 6 cycles means a well-kept adult shovelvole will produce roughly 230 grams of meat per cycle, and I can guarantee that I will have only adult shovelvoles in my egg-laying pens by switching them out from the death pen when an egg layer dies. The only drawback of this plan is that it's going to take a bit to get off the ground because they do still have to breed, and I'm out of time for today. So this is going to be a design that we will have to wait until the next episode to see the payoff from. And that is going to be all she wrote, folks. So as always, I will thank you for your time, direct your attention to all of the wonderful support options in the usual wonderful support locations, and hope that you enjoyed.